one of the great moments, maybe the great moment in Davos history. Rutger Bregman is the author of Utopia for Realists, and he joins us now. Mr. Bregman, I can't stop laughing just listening to that. And part of it makes me wonder, are you the first person ever to note that people are flying private to talk about global warming and that none of them mention tax avoidance? Has anyone ever said that before at Davos that you know of?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on Davos history, but it is a bit hypocritical, isn't it?
Just never gone to Davos and said it out loud as you did. So if I was wearing a hat, I would take it off to you. What response did you get?
I mean, they were not very happy with me, but I'm just I think a random Dutch historian who's basically saying whatever around the globe is thinking. You know, the vast majority of Americans for years and years now, according to the polls, including Fox News viewers and including Republicans, are in favor of higher taxes on the rich. You know, higher inheritance taxes, higher top marginal tax rates, higher wealth taxes. It's all really mainstream. But no one's saying that at Davos, just as no one's saying it on Fox News, right? And I think the explanation for that is quite simple, is that most of the people in Davos, but also here on this channel, have been bought by the billionaire class. You know, you're not meant to say these things. So I just went there and I thought, you know what? I'm just going to say it, just as I'm saying it right here on this channel.
Well, what was interesting, I thought, about what you said was you noted something. I mean, many people have called for higher taxes, but very few.
Well, not on this channel, is it? I mean, almost all of the pundits on this channel for years have been against higher taxes, right? Even though the vast majority of Americans is in favor of it.
I mean, I don't know. It would be interesting to know how many hours of Fox you've watched, but I'm interested in what you said about tax avoidance. So
yeah.
Just because someone faces a specific tax rate does not mean that person pays that tax rate at all. I don't think Netflix, for example, paid any taxes last year at all. So what would you do specifically to make certain that this class of people pays what they're supposed to pay?
Well, it's about multiple things. So we should really crack down on tax paradises and on tax avoidance. That's a major issue. But it's also about having higher taxes. So in the 1950s, for example, in the 1960s, in the golden age of capitalism, as historians called it, we had top marginal tax rate for the very rich of about, 70, 80, 90%. Actually under Eisenhower, the Republican president. And this was also, one of the best periods in American history. Same is true for the UK and the rest of Europe. So as a historian, for me, it's all not, it's really not rocket science. We should go back to simple and straightforward solutions from the past.
Right. But this country was sustained, and since you're a historian, I guess you would know this, sustained by an industrial economy at the time that was broad and deep. That created a middle class. That doesn't exist anymore. So it's an entirely different economy. I wish it did exist.
Oh well, but that's not really an issue. I mean,
work the same way with an entirely different economy?
Well, I think it would. I mean, America is still pretty much the most powerful country in the world, right? So if it really would want to, it could easily crack down on tax paradises. But the thing is, I mean, you guys have brought into power a president that doesn't even want to show its own tax returns. I mean, who knows how many billions he has hidden in the Cayman Islands or in Bermuda. So I think the issue really is one of corruption and of people being bribed and of not being, not talking about the real issues. What the family, what the Murdochs basically want you to do is to scapegoat immigrants instead of talking about tax avoidance. So I'm glad you're now finally raising the issue, but that's what's been happening for the past couple of years.
And I'm taking orders from the Murdochs. Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean, it doesn't work that directly. But I mean, you've been part of the Cato Institute, right? You've been a senior fellow there for years. You've been taking their dirty money. They're funded by cock billionaires,
Wait, why don't you tell me how it does work?
Well, it works by you taking their dirty money. It's as easy as that. I mean, you are a millionaire funded by billionaires. That's what you are. And I'm glad you now finally jumped the bandwagon, of people like Bernie Sanders and AOC. But you're not part of the solution, Mr. Carlson. You're part of the problem, actually.
AOC, but can I just say, and
It's true, right? It's true, right? That all the anchors on Fox, they're all millionaires. How is this possible? Well, it's very easy. You're just not talking about certain things.
Fox doesn't even play where you are.
It doesn't play where you are. Well, have you heard of the internet? I can watch things whatever I want, you know? I have, actually. I can't say I'm a great fan of your show, but I do my homework when you invite me on your show. So, I mean, you're probably not going to air this, but I went to Davos to speak truth to power, and I'm doing exactly the same thing right now. You might not like it, but you're a millionaire funded by billionaires, and that's the reason why you're not talking about these issues.
But I am talking about these issues.
Yeah, only now. Come on, you jumped the bandwagon. You're all like, oh, I'm against the globalist elite, blah, blah, blah. It's not very convincing, to be honest.
Why don't you go yourself, you tiny brain, and I hope this gets picked up, because you're a moron. I tried to give you a hearing, but you were too annoying.
You can't handle the criticism, can you?
There's a war on alternative.
Yeah, welcome to Literary Hangover. I'm Matt Leck. With me, Chris Leal.
Hello.
Is this, I think, the fourth time on this?
Yeah, sounds about right.
That was Rutger Bregman, the author of the book we're discussing today, and AOC follower, clout chaser, Tucker Carlson.
Ted Cruz seems to be these days, too.
Yeah, that's weird. I don't know if we even have time to
Get into
untangle
that. Yeah, I didn't want to veer us off course.
Stay away from him, AOC, is all I have to say. But it's funny that Tucker Carlson, he mentions, like, oh, do I take my orders from Rupert Murdoch? And we have this good little bit of audio from his time with Bub and the Love Sponge. Here's that audio.
Example, Sean Hannity was set to broadcast live from a Tea Party. And Rupert Murdoch the day before said, no, we don't support the Tea Party, we don't support the Republican Party, we don't support any party. And Rupert Murdoch did pull Hannity off of broadcasting live from the Tea Party.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit more complicated than that, but it was. I think it was a miscommunication. But look, I mean, you can go to the Tea Party events. I've been to a lot of Tea Party events. I spoke at a Tea Party event, and I wasn't. I'm not running as a Tea Party candidate. I'm not giving money to Tea Party people. I just, it's a great place to reach people.
Sure, but what I'm saying is at that point, Rupert Murdoch didn't want Hannity broadcasting from there.
Yeah, well, something happened, no doubt about that. I don't know if it was it Murdoch?
Yeah, it was because Murdoch received the question. They said, "Hey, you guys, Fox News, are part of
Murdoch's the most powerful man in America."
I mean, Rupert Murdoch, I've got to give him credit. When you talk about media conglomerates, he really knows what he's doing.
Yes,
he is smart.
He's very smart,
really smart, and tough.
You're his bitch.
I'm 100% his bitch. Whatever Mr. Murdoch says, I do.
Exactly. You know how you treat your migrant workers that shine up your Bentley and stuff? That Robert Murdoch could treat you that way.
Yeah, so there's Tucker. But he was also made a bitch there by Rutger Bregman, so much so they didn't air that segment. I would call Rutger Bregman, if anything, a effective communicator of a few things. A few things better, I think, than the left in America is good at communicating. Do you have any comment on the Tucker Carlson exchange?
Well, I was just going to say it was a 1-2 punch. He went to Davos and basically punked them at Davos. I don't know who there was responsible for scheduling him to speak, but he spoke there and did similar jujitsu on the stage. That's
what's interesting is so the Tucker Carlson appearance was from February 2019, and the Davos appearance was in January of 2019, and we can play that Davos thing a little bit. But what I like about the Tucker Carlson exchange is it effectively defangs Tucker's attempted co-opting of populist economic appeals. Mm-hmm. He zeroed in right away about the people taking private jets to go talk about climate change. And, the left itself here, fuck all those people. They're not going to solve climate change. We don't have any illusions they are either. Tax them.
Yeah, it was really quite masterful of him, how he, I use the word jujitsu, but it's like the analogy continued. Tucker Carlson was leaning in. He was excited. He was like, oh, yeah, this, anti-elitist message that I want to tap into. Let's do that. and then Bregman sort of like toyed with him, took a couple of bites at him, like a couple of negs. And then eventually went for the kill and was like, "You're not part of the solution."
Yeah, right, exactly.
Just called
like,
him out.
We can toy around with like that. We agree here, and that's actually the thing I really like is if I ever get invited on Fox News, that'll be the last time I'm invited on Fox News. Like I'm not going to try to make that a normal thing. I'm going to say something, and hopefully it's live. But even if it's not live, as Rutger Bregman demonstrates here, you've wasted Tucker Carlson's time, right? Like, as a person who produces a show like this, I mean, obviously not to the millions of people Tucker Carlson shows go out to, but if we have, like, book an interview and that, like, half hour is just a wasted time, like, that fucks up your schedule. So, yeah, what I'm saying is if you're on the left, don't pull a punch here, and then also record it yourself, like Bregman got this producer to do. He recorded it with a cell phone.
As a producer, Matt can sympathize with Carlson's producer team.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why I know like that's a point of attack. You are doing a good thing, even if that doesn't air. Bregman spooled this out perfectly, right? Like you get a few digs in there, but the thing is Tucker has to then decide, do I want to go and address that? Or do I just want to let that pass and try to continue on the charade as if we're in agreement here? I'm in agreement with this viral guy who just insulted Davos in a way that I'm trying to show that we're like trying to portray the right as the authentic critics of that, like those idiots.
He towed the edge perfectly there.
Yeah, so here's Bregman at Davos. Then this was in January of 2019.
Talk about the impact of
he doesn't address
what
the
happens
question.
when you give people who need cash to pull themselves up and the idea of a universal basic income.
Sure. Well, for some perspective, I must first say this is my first time at Davos, and I find it quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet. And I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. It feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water, right? There was only one panel, actually.
Well, we've had two. You're the second of our panelists.
There was only one panel.
Let's go there.
One panel hidden away in the media center that was actually about tax avoidance. Yeah. I was one of the 15 participants. So something needs to change here. 10 years ago, the World Economic Forum asked the question, what must industry do to prevent a broad social backlash? The answer is very simple. Just stop talking about philanthropy and start talking about taxes. Mm-hmm. Taxes. We need to... just 2 days ago, there was a billionaire in here, what's his name? Michael Dell. And he asked the question like, name me one country where a top marginal tax rate of 70% has actually worked. Mm-hmm. And, I'm a historian. The United States, that's where it has actually worked. In the 1950s, during Republican President Eisenhower, the war veteran, the top marginal tax rate in the US was 91% for people like Michael Dell. The top estate tax for people like Michael Dell was more than 70%. This is not rocket science. Mm-hmm. We can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. We can invite Bono once more, but come on, we got to be talking about taxes. Yes. That's it. Taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
Thank you.
It's funny to hear actual pearl clutching. Yeah. That's the sound of it. Let's go back a little bit. That is literal.
More, but come on, we got to be talking about taxes. Yes. That's it. Taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
Thank you.
He said bullshit.
Excellent PR strategy too to sell books.
This is
just go and crash interviews and
very excited for this. Maybe I should open a PR consultancy for how to sell a book. Is do stunts that here's a novel idea. Use actual good ideas that need to be expressed throughout society to benefit everybody as part of your PR campaign.
Jane Goodall on the panel too.
Jane Goodall is on the panel. She's massively upstaged here. Here it is. Oh, this guy. Here's one of those guys who was probably really upset by Rutger's comments.
Ken Goldman from Silicon Valley. I'm going to make a couple of comments, actually. I actually came because I do believe we have an issue here. But I have to say, honestly, this is a very one-sided panel. It's extremely one-sided. I was surprised the way we created this panel.
There's a MasterCard executive on the panel as well, so just putting that out there.
Wait,
The conference
Jane,
is very one-sided.
Can I talk, please?
Yeah.
You like use swear words too. Jane, thanks for. I saw you yesterday at lunch too. It was quite good. And we make comments to swear words with anecdotes and so forth. And all I've heard about here is talking about taxes. I haven't seen anything in correlation of growth, which I'll come back to it again. And just a couple of comments. Today, the U.S. basically has the lowest unemployment rate ever, the lowest black unemployment rate ever, the lowest youth unemployment ever. We've actually reduced poverty around the world. No one's talking about that.
Sorry, just have to point out these are long-term trends and not necessarily good. I mean, as Rutger Bregman points out with the 15-hour workweek stuff, but we'll get to that later.
That at all. People negated philanthropy. Just read a couple weeks ago the article on Bill Gates and what he's done in Africa and reducing malaria, reducing polio. So why don't we talk about that? So really I have a question for the panel. And yes, I agree tax avoidance is probably a big issue, probably a bigger issue than we think.
Probably. Yeah.
But instead of taxes, what else do you, instead of redistributing wealth, what are we talking about in terms of creating wealth? You know, frankly, what people really want is a dignity of a job. And we've given more jobs in the U.S. We've increased the minimum wage, just like California, with the minimum wage going to $15. May not be a lot, but it's up from $7. So I'd like for the panel to talk about beyond taxes, which every one of you have talked about. The only thing you've talked about in this whole panel on inequality. What can we really do to help solve inequality over time beyond taxes?
So, yeah, those are the two big media splashes Rutger's made that have put his book on the radar. And the book is, should probably roll this out, Utopia for Realists, How We Can Build the Ideal World. And it's been through a number of iterations. But it's written by Rutger Bregman. He's a popular historian from the Netherlands. He was born April 26th, 1988, so he's older than both of us, but not by much.
We got to get to work.
I know, god damn it. Just interpret any negative comments as professional jealousy. He's been working as a journalist for Der Correspondent since 2013. He's written a few other books, not in English, as far as I know, but one's The History of Progress, so this is kind of his theme here. This book actually originally came out in 2016, so he got his publicity going a little bit late. I think it might have just been translated later. I don't quite have that info here, but
if that's the U.S. edition or not,
right? Exactly. And it was a compilation of his magazine pieces, and actually, that's a funny thing about being a magazine writer. And this isn't a criticism of Bregman. I think the same thing applies to somebody like Hitchens, is because you review a bunch of smart ideas that other people sort of come up with, people sort of credit you with popularizing those, even though they're not yours, and you become this sort of like Rutger and he even talks about it in his press tour, where he's like the UBI guy all of a sudden.
Right. Yeah, because the book is it's a great book. And again, not a knock on him. He's doing a great job. But it's not like any of the individual, pieces of information are revolutionary, right? He's making a very straightforward case for this, which is, been made elsewhere, but needs to be made louder and more effectively. And he's a very effective communicator. His analogies with the, at Davos being, a firefighting conference and not being able to talk about water.
Right. Yeah.
And throughout the book, he makes a lot of good, analogies. I liked his one about, poor people and how we stigmatize that. And, it actually being comparing it to a computer and it being overloaded and stuff.
Yeah, actually, he's basically his idea, and I think it's chapter 3 or 4. But anyway, one of them where he basically he argues that, I think very persuasively, that being poor is not a problem of character; it's a problem of lack of money, and those things don't follow from each other. That he had a TED Talk called something very similar to that I think was even maybe his first big taste at, I guess, minor thought leading or whatever you want to call it. But, oh yeah, poverty isn't a lack of character, it's a lack of cash. That's from April 2017.
That billionaire jumping, or, the billionaire sympathizer jumping up. And
hilarious.
What about rich people? Stop
yeah.
talking. Immediately, it's like, well, black people are working.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, you can already see it there, and I've been talking about this a lot lately, is my prediction for what you're going to see from the wealthy as it becomes clear that the rest of society doesn't want to put up with their shit anymore, is what we talked about in Democracy in Chains episode, which is that rich people should become a protected class and have certain rights, and property rights should basically be like, you can't go at property rights just like you can't discriminate.
They basically had their foot on that lever. That's like that's the reason, there's the Electoral College and the Senate, it feels like, historically or whatever. It's like,
yeah, exactly.
Protections of the quote unquote minority. And it's like, yeah, the people with money.
Yeah. And now, I mean, they like to hide it. It's like a shell game, because do you see Scott Walker talking about why justifying gerrymandering, basically saying that it's unfair that there's more people in cities than the countryside. And if you affected that, then the cities would get more representation. It's like, yeah, man, there's more people there.
Right. He believes strongly in the voting rights of land.
Yeah, exactly.
Less concerned about the voting rights of black people and minorities broadly, but land in particular needs to be represented.
And we have to be honest. In terms of what this country was set up to do, he's not wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, it's bad and it should be changed, but he's not wrong about the lineage. That's the weird thing about all this right-wing stuff is they can't... I think what they're upset about and why they say the left is winning the culture war is because they can't say they want the things that, basically the founding fathers wanted them to inherit. Like like a racially stratified country. But anyway... Happy 4th of July, everybody. Before we get into the first chapter here, I just want to look at the cover. And there's a blurb there. Bold thinking, fresh ideas, and lively prose. And that's attributed to our good friend Steven Pinker. Which is, to me, a red flag. I'm not a Steven Pinker fan. As you pointed out, there are some... things are getting better in terms of extreme poverty sort of stats early on in the book, which Steve Pinker probably just read to that part and stopped reading.
He's like, let me just put that up front, and then that's all he needs to know.
But what kind of saved it for me is and we're going to go from this, Rutger Bregman, How to Build a Better World. This was published on April 3rd, 2019 by the How To Academy. And Bregman takes a shot at Pinker, even though he blurbed his book.
Wow. Holds no punches.
I know. This is really where, more than the Tucker or the Davos thing, it's going at Pinker that really...
made you fall in love.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't want to spoil my conclusion on this.
And what has driven that, do you think? I mean, what across that period of 4 or 5 years, what are the main governing forces that have driven that change?
Well, partly it's just hard work. It's activism. So people were quite dismissive, for example, of the Occupy Wall Street. Many people still believe, that wasn't effective at all. Well, actually, Occupy Wall Street got us Bernie Sanders. Yeah. Bernie Sanders got us people like the AOC, etc. It all needs each other, right? It all builds on each other. So this is the issue I sometimes have with these. There have been quite a few books recently about how the world is better than ever, right? And
yes.
It's true, right? I start my book with that as well, is that we've seen extraordinary declines of poverty and people are much healthier today. We are basically richer, wealthier, healthier than ever, We've seen tremendous progress in the past 2 years. But then many of these books, like Steven Pinker's books, for example, sort of it feels as if they make the point, stop complaining, everything is awesome. And they have this very sanitized view of history, right? Where just some guy in the 17th century had some great idea, like, let's all be rational. And then 300 years later, everyone was healthy. Sort of that. History doesn't work like that. People actually fought for those changes. And all those people who, for example, who first argued for the abolition of slavery, or for democracy, or for equal rights for men and women, they paid a high price for that. They were persecuted and ridiculed and dismissed, etc. And I think that's often ironic with these writers, is that now they talk about, these social justice warriors, and they're not grateful for how wonderful everything is. Well, actually, those social justice warriors were the ones making all this progress possible in the past 200-300 years.
Because the interesting...
So there he is again. I love that take. It's very similar with ones I make. I mean, that you can quibble with certain elements of online social justice culture, I guess. But the idea that it represents a problem and not part of the solution, to me, is wrong-headed, to say the least. And I love that he's willing to specifically mention Pinker, who's one. I mean, there are plenty of people you could go at that are more fringe than Pinker and probably less of a respected figure. Like, I think Pinker is still generally, I mean, he gets all the sort of Harvard speaking stuff and like that, but
puts a respectable veneer.
I think Pinker is just basically a modern Pangloss. But it's very funny that Rutger got him to blurb his book. As he mentions, he starts his book off with the ideal, with that sort of idealistic optimism thing. The Thomas Hobbes, we went from a nasty Brutus and short existence to the Industrial Revolution.
The statistic that he gives, by the way, is in 1820, 84% of the world lived in extreme poverty. And in 1981, 160 years later, 44%, half of that, in extreme poverty. Oh, no. So 1820 was 84%. 1981 was 44%. And today, it's under 10%.
Does it say what constitutes poverty? Is it calorie-based, or I don't know?
I'm sure there's a cost of living index that includes, like living expenses and things like that.
Well, whatever the metrics are, he does make a persuasive case that we've reached a sort of approximation of the medieval utopia, cocaine, spelled Cockaigene, which is basically like all this, any food you want, sort of like, and basically Bregman says this is fast food, and I sort of agree with him about that. Like, the amount of things, especially now you have Seamless, it's ridiculous the amount of consumption you can do very easily as a citizen of the world now. And he says I think something a lot of the left agrees with, that this has led to sort of end of history ennui. Where do we go from here? Is it a technocracy governed by advertising and pharmaceuticals? And so he's not a utopian. He's not a techno optimist or anything like that. He's critical here.
Bregman,
yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the statistics are fair. You and I have gone back and forth on these before. And
I basically think that they're used for overly detailed representations to create a misleading idea about general trends and political, especially when it becomes political.
Well, once again, I mean, Bregman just he hit it on the head when that's true. Like, those facts are true, and then the question is, there's a group of people using that in a defensive mechanism, and trying to dismiss criticism. Mm-hmm. But there's another line of argument, which is saying, that is true, but at the same time, there are still these other inequities, in, the disparity between that being true and our current state of affairs. There's something to be learned there, something we should be doing differently, which is a different message.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting about this book is, like we said, he originally published it in 2016, and it's a sort of thing where it's a calling for something, and that something has actually sort of now arrived, as he suggests here, in terms of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. By the way, Not as good as Ilhan Omar. I just need to put that out there.
Ooh.
But just going to say
AOC, I still love you if you're listening.
Yeah.
True for basic income, actually.
Absolutely. Let's meander through the book a bit and its arguments, because I think it's very important to emphasize that the book, A, is very readable, and also it's not just about economics and public policy, it's also about psychology and ideas and their power. And one of its central contentions is that when the crash happened, there was a kind of moment of cognitive dissonance, which you talk about. There was no... People at least didn't think there was a readily available idea or set of ideas with which to deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. And to explain this point properly, maybe we should go back all the way to the 50s.
Yeah.
Because what always fascinates me about the rise of this thing we call neoliberalism, or the whole Reagan and Thatcher phenomenon, is that it didn't start in the 70s or the 80s. It actually started in the 50s with people like the economist Milton Friedman or the Austrian philosopher Friedrich von Hayek, who came together in this place called Mont Pelerin in Switzerland. And they founded this Mont Pelerin Society. And back then they said, we're the real radicals right now. You know, in the 50s, everyone was basically a socialist, or at least the Keynesian, they believed in big government. But we had tax rates of like 80, 90% for the very rich. Unimaginable right now, but that worked pretty well in this golden age of capitalism. So they said to themselves, we're the radicals, and what we need to do is start developing our ideas, you know, building our institutions, our think tanks. And this will take years and years and years. But at some point, there will be a crisis in the current system, and then we can take over. And this is exactly what happened in the 70s with the stagflation and the oil crises, and then Reagan and Thatcher came on the scene. But if you want to understand those politicians, you really got to go back all the way to the 50s. Now, what I think happened in 2008 is that we had another crash, obviously, where it was a great opportunity to inject new ideas, basically in the bloodstream of thinking, but they just weren't there. So the issue with many people on the so-called, how do you want to call it, the left or progressives, was that they knew very well what they were against a lot of things, right? Against austerity, against homophobia, against racism, against growth, against climate change, basically against everything, but not what they were for. Like they had sort of...
Before he gets to the part I agree with, I'll just point to, or hit on for the first time, one of my critiques of this book is that Bregman suggests that this is a result of a lack of ideas, or ideas not being there at the right place at the right time, and so forth. I am a bit more cynical than that. I think it's a lot more about... I don't think neoliberalism, for instance, won because it was the best idea. It won because it was an idea serviceable to people in power. And so you fundamentally have to change power. It's not just about having the best ideas and making people adopt it.
Part of the whole idea that you need some kind of utopian vision before you actually want to go next. So that was a problem back then. But the exciting thing, actually, in that respect, the book is already a little bit outdated, maybe, because in the past couple of years, things have changed so much. If you look at a politician like AOC now in the United States, I mean, she's the person I've always been dreaming about, the kind of politician, right?
Yes, I think.
So that's very exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's probably something his publisher didn't like him to say. His book's a little bit outdated already.
It's a shame Bregman can't run for the House seat or something. Yeah, too bad he's not American.
Yeah, no, he's not going to be a politician. Just, he actually talks later in this. He's writing a book on altruism, I think. The sharing instinct. How we're not all greedy, apparently. So, chapter 2, entitled, Why We Should Give Free Money to Everyone. And here we get into UBI. And he goes into a number of different case studies. One in London, a few in Uganda, Malawi, Namibia. Turns out that free money is good. I mean, what's your take on the giving away money thing?
Look, I mean, UBI, people are increasingly talking about it. You know, Bregman, Andrew Yang, his freedom dividend.
Yeah.
Which is, I like the word dividend. That's clever messaging. But anyway, the concept sounds kind of radical, giving people free cash. But when you look at it from a structural perspective in the economy, and you consider, just the changes in the workforce, and just fundamentally productivity, which is what drives the economy, implies doing more with less labor. So if we're successful at that, it means we will produce more over time with less and less people, meaning there's always a downward pressure on the demand for labor in a productive economy.
Mm-hmm.
And, in a long term anyway. And so eventually, we got lucky that we went from agriculture to industrial, and we found a new, massive industry to, repopulate the labor force. But you have to consider if eventually people are working, people are going to have to work less time. We're going to have to spread that work around. And when your economy is based 70% of GDP is based on consumption, then at some point it makes sense to just have direct cash transfers.
Yeah. Consumer bucks.
Exactly. For people to go and spend that. That's the most stimulative form of spending, is to give that money out to the people who will spend it. Rich people will be more likely to just put it in their bank account and earn interest. Interest income is not as stimulative as the consumption income.
Oh, yeah. We need to go to our good friend, Gordon Gekko, who was on CNBC back in the original Bernie 2016 campaign. Here he is, and I think the CNBC people are a bit surprised that he endorses Bernie. But the reason he says is exactly this thing. It's not a production problem, but a circulation problem. That's a sort of Keynesian take on this.
On to the presidential elections, I'm curious. We're asking everybody essentially who you think the best candidate for the economy would be.
Bernie Sanders.
Without a doubt. Why is that?
No question.
Policies?
Well, I think it's quite simple again. If you look at something called velocity of money, you guys know what that is, I presume. That means how much gets spent and turns around. When you have the top 1% getting money, they spend 5-10% of what they earn. When you have the lower end of the economy getting money, they spend 100 or 110% of what they earn. As you've had a transfer of wealth
marginal
to the
propensity
top and a
of
transfer
consumption.
of income to the top, you have a shrinking consumer base, basically, and you have a shrinking velocity of money. Mm-hmm. Bernie is the only person out there who I think is talking at all about both fiscal stimulation and banking rules that will get the banks to begin to generate lending again as opposed to speculation. Okay. So from an economic point of view, it's straightforward.
It really is that simple mechanically, and it's crazy how obscured that point is through the economy.
And that's how I think this is the crux of this debate, and why I think it's so interesting to me. This is on one side, to be overly reductive, you have the Keynes versus the Marx side of this, right? And I think that's where the real debate is in the left. And I'm not, and I think we'll get into the Alyssa Battistoni discussion of UBI for dissent, which I 100% agree with. I think it's a necessary critique of UBI, but there's certain critiques of UBI from more orthodox Marxist sources. I forget the one that we both read.
The really bad one?
Yeah, not great. I mean, look, I think there are certain things about, for instance, I don't think we will get a real UBI in this country that takes away the cudgel that forces people to work. I just don't think we're ever going to agree to pass something like that with Congress. And so I agree that it's always one that's good enough to be super useful for significant structural change is unlikely to pass in any reasonable time frame.
Oh.
I think a bad one is inevitable, though. But what I would say about Marxists is don't start sounding like the Peterson Foundation and talking about deficit spending. That's not persuasive to anybody anymore. And if you rely on that, I mean, I'm not saying become a modern monetary theory devotee that you can just spend whatever, for instance, but it's true enough to be functional to the point where that's where I don't know. What do you have to say?
Yeah, the bad criticism from that perspective seems to just be what they were just upset that they view that it sustains the life of this system, but it, I just feel that that's disingenuous, and I don't think that, I think it's splitting hairs, basically.
I mean, I think it can, and I think actually, well, I mean, Bregman admits that this does it does, for instance, probably anesthetize, societal turmoil a little bit, and to the extent that it's doing that by alleviating poverty, it's hard to argue against for me. I mean, I don't think if you want to maintain a stable society, I don't think having poverty like America has maintained is good for you.
Right. Look, this is a time bomb, and this is why this situation is inevitable, because the United States has created our economy is structured on consumption, as we already said. 7/10 of every dollar spent on buying shit. Okay. And when you have, whatever the insane statistics are, 1% owning, as much as the bottom 90 or whatever it is, think about your heart as an organ, basically, and the money as this velocity of money. It's blood circulating through your body. And if you clog up an artery and all of a sudden all the blood is accumulating in one part, you can get by for a while, but then there's these massive attacks. And there's some sort of correction. It's just unsustainable as a system. Yeah. And so something, has to give at some point.
And as Bregman points out, solving poverty is actually easily doable with our current budget expenditures. We could abolish it. The problem I have with Bregman is I think there's a reason we haven't done that beyond people just haven't gotten the idea. I think that's something to be maintained.
Yeah, well, and that's why he doesn't just come at it from some rational, analytical, perspective. He has great analogies, as we've already alluded to, about, one of the stigmatizations is that, these poor people are poor because, they're just not frugal enough or industrious enough or thrifty enough. They don't work hard enough. It's their own fault. And it's like, well, no, there are results of this systemic inequalities that exist, and this is what they look like. And, his analogy to computers being overloaded was great. And then in chapter 2, he has a quote where he says, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't have boots. Right. It's like, duh, give people boots.
And it's interesting that I think he also dunks on microfinance, which was, I think, a big trend, especially in The Economist, like 15 years ago, for instance, and it ended up turning out it's a good way to make farmers commit suicide. And that's not a joke. Like in India, literally had it happened in like epidemic proportions. But the other thing that I think is more aware than, say, Andrew Yang, who I think as a trash UBI, I'm absolutely against it. I've been at war with the Yang gang. On Twitter significantly.
I will say, in terms of framing the conversation, it's good to have. I mean, it would be better if he had a better, tighter argument on it. They questioned him right out of the gate, "How are you going to pay for this?" And he just had this, deer in the headlights look on his face.
Oh yeah, he's definitely not ready for prime time.
But look, it's good that people are talking. That he's talking about it in general.
I'll say I don't like that. Just the way he decides to pay for it.
I'm not pro Yang, by the way.
Here's what I'll say. If Yang was talking like Rutger Bregman is talking about the UBI, I'd be pro Yang. He's not, which is why it's still beef Yang.
They do that for 20, 30 years, then they have their midlife crisis, and then they use all that money they extracted from the rest of the population to paint for the rest of their lives or something like that.
Oh yeah, and Bregman just ending a riff there on bullshit jobs, which, as we talked about, is a concept developed by other people. David Graeber specifically, and about how many people in the economy, regardless of how well remunerated their job is, feel like it could actually be done without society. It's not really contributing much. And he goes on to talk about the...
Soon they'll find robots agree with them.
Yeah, exactly.
This is getting dangerously like a scene from Fight Club. But to bring it back to policy wonkery. Again, one of the objections is how does this relate to the pre-existent and often invariably hugely complicated benefit system in a society? I mean, if you were to introduce a basic income in Britain, how would it replace the benefit system? Would it be supplementary to it? How would it work?
it's important to emphasize here that there are many versions of basic income out there. So there are some really bad or even horrible versions of basic income that are being advocated. So there are some, for example, American libertarians who say, let's just abolish the whole welfare state and just give people one small cash grant. I'm not in favor of that. In fact, I think that would be disastrous. A basic income would really be a supplement to the great achievements of the 20th century, right? Universal healthcare, quality public education, and then a universal basic income or guaranteed basic income. That's really the way I think about it. Now, how do you finance it? There are obviously 1,000 ways to finance it, and I'd like to finance it in a way that it will reduce inequality. Also important to emphasize here, there are ways that you could finance a basic income that it will actually increase inequality, right? So the devil is in the details here. Okay, well...
Yeah, so that's the thing, is Bregman goes right into, and Annie Lowry, who is also of the Washington Post, or maybe she's the New York Times now, who is also a proponent of UBI-like schemes, talks about, go after carbon tax, high frequency trading, progressive things, basically. The problem I have with Andrew Yang is the number one thing he says he's going after is consolidating welfare programs. And he mentions disability. He was forced to clarify he doesn't mean SSDI, he just means SSI. But the problem with these sorts of things is you can have a critique of means-tested welfare programs as, needlessly exclusionary in certain cases, unfair. There's lots of hoops. There's all sorts of problems with them. And they get looked down upon, although I think that is lessened if everyone's getting a check from the government, for instance. But you can cut those programs when you've solved that underlying problem, in my opinion. Like, when you've done something about food accessibility, then you can do something about food stamps. That's not how you're paying for your UBI. I'm sorry. If you want to run as a Republican with that kind of UBI, be my guest, because I think that would frankly be helpful if Yang was challenging Trump, because I think
he's primarying somebody, yeah.
Exactly. I think his UBI is reactionary. There's a reason he goes on Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro and talks about, welfare Trojan horses, and not, frankly, nobody, this is just for literary hangover listeners. We usually don't like to get politicians on our programs, the programs I produce, but unless they're Bernie Sanders, because he has we have a hotline for him.
Mm-hmm.
But possible we have Yang on actually, frankly, not after the debate. If he polls 5%, we might try to get him on and take him on some of this stuff. But I think it's bad. I think it's I don't trust him, and I understand the stuff. And actually, Bregman agrees with you about the framing, like the citizens' dividend or whatever he calls it.
Mm-hmm.
And but I worry about, and I this might be a bit too nitpicky. I worry about that sort of nationalistic thing, because I think there's a larger problem with UBI.
Well,
but go ahead.
Look, so he's right, and Bregman, obviously, who is consistently on point, pointing out that there are people on opposing ends of the political "quote-unquote" spectrum.
And he goes into Nixon and Milton Friedman and all those people.
And so going back to, if you assume this inevitability in the economy, and, basically most of people's jobs is just to recirculate money through the economy, and that's how we, magically grow. Then you just want them to, spend that cash. Then you have to think giving them cash directly rather than some archaic Byzantine system of like food stamps, for example. Like, instead of just giving someone $1,000, I'm going to, spend $1,000 to give them, I don't even know what the percentages are, but maybe like $650 or $700, because then you have administration fees, and then they create these actual stamps, and then you have to have things set up for businesses to accept them, when it's just just give them the money. This is wasteful spending. And
absolutely, yeah.
So it is useful, but you're right. There's no point in doing that to solve this problem if you're just shooting yourself in the foot by getting rid of everything else. And so, I think over time there is room to get, some of the most basic cash transfer programs, basically like food stamps. This is just a more efficient version of that. But people will still need, maybe supplemental income, or they will need healthcare, obviously, or housing assistance, or plenty of other things. And so, I think politically, I think mathematically there will be some benefit to streamlining or, making basically our welfare system more sane and rational over time. But you can't necessarily pitch that as, we're just going to do this to cut expenses. You're doing this because you're going to grow revenues too.
Yeah, exactly. I think my thing with UBI is the more decommodified essentials are in your society, the more a UBI actually interests me, right? Because I can tell you right now, a UBI would benefit this show substantially. If all of you listening to this had an extra $1,000 a month that you could spend, that's going to Patreon, shit like that, right? Self-interested, I'd love it if lots of you had a lot more money. The problem is, so does your landlord. So do, for instance, people who own medical or student loan debt, debt that, in my opinion, shouldn't even be paid back. Yeah, exactly.
Cancel it.
And that's the thing is, there are two ways you can go about this. You can either just say abolish student or medical debt, or you can give the people money to pay back the people who own the debt that shouldn't have existed in the first place. And I think that's why UBI appeals to people on the right, I think. And I mean, look, if you're a landlord, imagine, right? Right. You have I know for a fact you have $1,000 more a month in your pocket. Sorry, rent is going up, at least $250. And the problem with Yang is, I don't want, my red line is this, and I recognize that this might seem unreasonable to some people, but this is, as a representative of the American left, no programs that are redistributionary are cut until you deal with those underlying problems more specifically. Because I got in this argument with Scott Statins or something, who's a big Yang guy. And his header is literally UBI, it's not left, it's not right, it's forward. And I got in an argument with him because Yang clarified that SSDI, which is my understanding, it's disability assistance. So think of things like wheelchairs or whatever. The average
unable to work.
Yeah, and the average is $1,200. So it was unclear whether people would have to choose that or choose the $1,000 Yang bucks. And they clarified, that stacks. And everyone's like, yeah, see, that's good. Isn't Andrew Yang good? But it doesn't stack with all these other things. It doesn't stack with food stamps. It doesn't stack with SSI, another form of disability insurance, more focused on income disparities, right? So why not just stack that? And it would be I would support it if it's stacked with all that stuff, right? And then they try to give you a runaround well, those things are bad. It's I know means tested programs are bad. I'm a socialist. I don't advocate any of that shit, right? But that said, I'm not going to take it from somebody because it's they got it.
Well, and so this may be, a weird marriage of interests or perspectives on the show, and to counter, Buttigieg when he was on stage the other week. I think they were specifically talking about education or something like that. But if you had a proper UBI, it should go to everyone, even wealthy people. Just like if Buttigieg in particular was talking about tuition-free college, and he was like, I don't believe billionaires' kids, should get free college. It's well, guess what? Their parents are going to be paying the taxes that are helping, fund this. So yes, everyone should go because that's going to lessen resistance to the program. Yeah. Everyone should get it. And maybe everyone, gets a base level, and then you could have income supplements, that help that help, in addition to that. And obviously if everyone has healthcare and other various forms of structural assistance, then they need less cash for just to exist, basically.
Yeah.
But I do think as you mentioned, I think the dividend, I think the framing is very important. I think national service, and to take the other side, not to Buttigieg has his faults, but I think people should be talking about national service as an element. I do think there is some element of dignity of work. I think there is something to that, and people are going to want to, and not even just of I'm getting this money I feel guilty. But like, people need something to do with their time. They value that. They need something to put their energies forth into. And, you know, some people are going to be very good about finding that on their own, a hobby or an interest or something. But some people, you know, look, have a national service. You know, people spend some time and contribute, and then that entitles them to this set of, you know, options, just like when people served in the war, you know, and you got the GI Bill.
Yeah, I mean, the Citizens Conservation Corps, except not whites only, I think would be a good thing. Yeah, and I mean, it is a shame to see Buttigieg of the Marxist father and the Bernie report in college recently said, like, it's not us versus them to billionaires, and he's been fundraising really good since then. Let's see, what else? Oh, here's a bit more Rutger Bregman addressing the idea of a Trojan horse UBI. And he makes a case of why he thinks the left needs to actually push for it. And I'm skeptical. I guess my original take was that the left should let, like, liberals deal with UBI and worry about decommodifying healthcare, like Medicare for all, and, you know, get housing and get the important stuff, the tough stuff, and let UBI to the other people. But Bregman makes the case that the left should be on the playing field here.
The question about how do we make sure that, you know, we aim for a version of basic income that would actually improve life for the vast majority of people. Well, here my answer is very simple. Make sure that you take the idea for yourself. You know, I've read quite a lot of pieces like of authors who say, "Oh, basic income is a horrible story. It's a neoliberal Trojan horse. Look, I heard Mark Zuckerberg say that he's in favor of basic income, and Elon Musk is as well. So it must be a horrible idea." I don't know. That's such lazy thinking, isn't it? As I said, there are horrible versions, bad versions of basic income out there. That only puts more pressure on us to properly define what we're talking about and come up with the versions that do make a difference for the vast majority of people. And then final.
Yeah, so I think that's actually why we're doing this show.
Yeah, well, that, and also I view that as, look, it's something to be watched and managed, but it's good that you have some people on the other side, quote unquote, making the case for this to some of the hardest people that it would be for you to possibly, you know, reach and convince.
Yeah.
You know? Even if it gets you, you know, 2/3 of the way there, and you have to really hammer out the last third, like, at least they're doing a lot of legwork for you. You know, I mean, I'm an optimistic, I think, you know, in that perspective.
Yeah, it depends. I don't want any help from the right on that. Actually, let's go to Alyssa Battistoni. She wrote it's a review more of Andy Stern's UBI, but she also touches on Rutger Bregman's. Andy Stern being like some labor guy who discovered UBI as a solution to to union weakness, basically. And he has the trash UBI, the Yang thing, where immediately you start going after welfare programs. So I'm going to play some selections here from Battistoni, and I think this is definitely the best thing I've read on UBI so far. And I think we've had her at least on Majority Report. She's a Jacobin writer, but this was in Dissent.
It's often noted that Milton Friedman as well as Martin Luther King, Jr. supported basic income, and the new generation of advocates is similarly eclectic, running the gamut from Trump-supporting venture capitalists like Thiel to fully automated luxury communists like Peter Fraze. There are, in short, many different reasons for supporting UBI and just as many versions of what it could be.
Yeah.
One version functions as a kind of noblesse oblige, a handout to the unfortunates being made obsolete by robots smarter and more efficient than they are. Another version aspires to egalitarian universalism and challenges the legitimacy of privately accumulated wealth. There's a version that sees UBI as the spark for a generation of entrepreneurs, and another that simply attempts to stave off a revolt of the precarious masses. Basic income is therefore often posited as a post-ideological solution suited to a new era of politics. The odd confluence of interest from the left and right tends to be read as a sign that political positions should be eschewed in favor of rational compromise. But UBI's cross-ideological appeal is the bug, not the feature. Because basic income is politically ambiguous, it also has the potential to act as a Trojan horse for the left or right, left critics fret that it will serve as a vehicle for dissolving the remains of the welfare state, while proponents herald it as the capitalist road to communism. The version of basic income we get will depend, more than policies with a clearer ideological valence, on the political forces that shape it. Which is why the prospect of pushing for basic income in the United States right now, when the right controls everything, should be cause for alarm. UBI's supporters on the left should proceed with caution. But that doesn't mean basic income is a lost cause. To the contrary, capitalism's inability to provide a means of making a decent living for the over 7 billion people currently alive is one of its most glaring defects and one of the most significant opportunities for the left to offer an alternative. A universal basic income, though not the only answer, might point us in the right direction.
So yeah, and that critique is similar to the one Majority Report has had of the Young Turks Wolfpack project, which intends to call a constitutional convention to get money out of politics. And the second you do that is the second the Koch brothers swoop in and are like, oh yeah, by the way, balanced budget amendment, motherfuckers.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, how that appeals, especially with so many people fed up, with the establishment. They're like, let's, rewrite the Constitution. People are just like, yeah. And it's like, guess who holds all the cards right now?
Yeah, exactly.
Guess who's in power? Not even regardless of if the Republicans had controlled all the chambers and the executive branch currently, which they do. Even if that wasn't the case, like inequality and the hold, of the economic elites are still there. There are lobbyists with legislation ready to go, that they could be tailored to whatever it is that they want, that is too complex, for the average person to really discern, the devil in those details. But the same isn't said for, the common citizen and the average man. I mean, we don't have hungry lobbyists writing legislation for us.
Right.
Also, I was going to say that, you're right. I mean, there's hesitancy on this, and it is something to watch. But UBI, you could easily see, is just a few steps removed from the next, conservative welfare reform plan, and we're going to slash X hundred billion or X percent from the welfare budget, and we're just going to reform it with UBI, boom, and we're just going to give them their cash and wipe our hands, and we'll be done here.
Yeah, I mean, the problem that I think they're going to have, and that Battistoni points to in a part I don't think I have clipped, but the Democrats suck so bad at appealing to what really ails average people that if they actually did some economic populism, they could be electorally very difficult. But instead, when Trump does like an infrastructure program, it's like making toll roads and shit, right? Like it's not like
it's public-private investment. It's not the U.S. government is going to spend $1 trillion. It's the U.S. government is going to spend X amount, and we're going to match private funds. And in exchange for that, we're going to sell off the rights for all this infrastructure that private companies are going to build that you'll then pay twice for it. Your taxes will go to construct it, and then you'll pay tolls, not until the project is paid off and you get and then it's free as it used to be. It's indefinite tolls forever.
Yeah. Okay, let's continue with Battistoni here.
The view of UBI as the foundation of the gig economy, meanwhile, is a tacit acknowledgement that capitalism can't pay its full costs, a transfer of responsibility for a living wage from private employers to the public. Then there's an even worse case for UBI as pressure outlet. Stern argues that basic income supporters would do well to convince the anxious rich that it's their best bet to avoid the guillotine amidst growing inequality and desperation. But you don't need to be Robespierre to be suspicious of a proposal that explicitly announces its intent to protect the rich from working-class rage, particularly when one of the major questions of UBI is where the free money will come from. Stern cautions UBI supporters against advocating a soak-the-rich tax on political grounds. The broad coalition that UBI requires will be impossible if the rich are against it from the start. Alas, this is already the metric for most policies.
Right.
Instead, he proposes to fund UBI by cashing out major welfare programs, food stamps, housing assistance, the earned income tax credit, and charging a value-added tax on consumer goods. More tentatively, he considers a wealth tax, a financial transaction tax, and cuts to military spending. But funding a basic income by cannibalizing existing welfare programs and imposing regressive consumption taxes perversely places the burden of subsidizing low wages on the poor and working class people making them in the first place.
Andrew Yang.
That this is a
Meaning
proposal put forth by a former labor leader is a measure of the left's weakness.
Meaning if you're redistributing wealth, then if you're just circulating it amongst people that have nothing, it doesn't really do a lot.
And indeed, Stern's view of labor's political prospects is remarkably dim. In fact, UBI is explicitly posed as a solution to the problem of declining union power. It was time for me to look beyond unions for answers, Stern declares in the first 30 pages. Instead, he proposes a basic income party that could run candidates in every congressional district and threaten a tax strike, the weapon of the wealthy, until Congress agrees to vote on a basic income package.
Okay.
It's obviously a non-starter. But it reveals the limits of Stern-style unionism. Start out collaborating with Walmart on healthcare, and soon you'll hope only for the dwindling state to throw a few bucks at the reserve army of Uber drivers tasked with ferrying the rich from one gentrified enclave to the next. Instead of fighting off the dystopian future, settle into the interregnum of the present, with all its morbid symptoms. But as the writer Ben Tarnoff has pointed out, the places where technological development hasn't produced a dystopian, jobless future, like Sweden, don't just have technology, they also have strong unions and a robust welfare state. The kind of starkly unequal society that Stern and other UBI futurists fear wouldn't just come about because the robots arrived, it would come about because only a few people owned them.
And upcoming here is Battistoni's critique of Bregman, and she offers a different reading of a Keynes quote that Bregman offers, and I think it's a little bit more sophisticated one.
Recognizing this, Bregman explicitly advocates massive redistribution of money, time, and robots, that is, of income, work, and the means of production. All wealth is socially produced, he argues, and so it should be shared accordingly. It's not so much that this time is different, it's that we have the chance to make it so. Though he stops short of inciting us to seize the robots outright, he advocates taxes on the wealthy and on financial transactions as a means to both fund basic income and disincentivize certain activities like banking that make money without creating anything of value. Though Bregman's version of UBI is far more appealing on the merits, his political program is disappointing. Ideas change the world, Bregman declares, and UBI is such an obviously good idea that we just need to spread the word. The last line of the book belongs to Keynes, the book's implicit hero, who famously said of ideas, "Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. But of course, it's ruled by many other things, money and power chief among them." The 15-hour work week Keynes predicted didn't come to pass because the idea alone wasn't enough. More importantly, Keynes was talking about ideology rather than ideas per se, about the systems of thought that underpin our assumptions whether or not we know it, not just clever notions.
Per se is the misreading there. And then here's the last section of this that I want to play.
The debate about basic income is about the obligations we have to one another, the origins of property, the ends of human life, the shape of our society. And when these broader visions are translated into policy, they don't simply suggest a shared plan to give people money, they offer drastically different accounts of how much money people should get, where it should come from, and who should get it. The leftist futurist version of basic income is often described as a non-reformist reform, per Van Parijs's quip, a goal that's achievable within capitalism but that has the potential to change the conditions of capitalism enough to lead beyond it.
This is a very, I think, tantalizing concept, the non-reformist reform. And I think where people are social democrats or versus democratic socialists, I think, is the degree to which you believe that reforms through institutions can lead to a revolution to a class of society or some such. But I think a UBI as instituted based on my dictatorial control would be a non-reformist reform, because it would be on top of everything, regardless of what assistance you're getting now. That includes food stamps. That includes, well, maybe we would get rid of the mortgage deductions and stuff like that. Especially for like second houses. I don't know. Like
maybe for second, you probably want it for first.
Yeah.
Only because of the spending multiplier. Houses are one of the biggest expenses.
Although housing policy is going to be a tough thing for climate change. If we're thinking about that, we might need more renters in the future than suburban homeowners. But that's a topic for another subject.
Basic income is the fully automated monorail to luxury communism, where we all own the robots and everyone gets what they need. This UBI isn't a backstop for bad jobs, but the material condition for human fulfillment. But not just any income will do. For it to be a genuine step toward a post-work society, it has to be genuinely universal and unconditional, provide enough income to actually live on, and supplement rather than replace the welfare state. This UBI is the one that draws from the Marxist feminists who pointed out the unwaged labor of social reproduction in the 1970s, the working class women of color who fought for the rights of welfare recipients in the 1960s, and the architects of the freedom budget who attempted to translate the gains of the civil rights movement into a program for economic justice. They wanted not just a basic income but a sufficient one adequate not merely to survive, but to live a decent life, and maybe even a good one. The right-wing version of basic income, by contrast, wherein paltry lumps of cash replace public services and goods, is a UBI not worth having. This version of basic income is a mechanism to streamline. A more accurate word might be gut the welfare state in the name of libertarian ideas of freedom. People know what they need better than the state does, the argument goes. How people will be able to afford healthcare on $12,000 a year is less often addressed. Who exactly should get a basic income is another question. It's sometimes called a citizen's dividend, explicitly limiting recipients by nationality. More generally, the universal is aspirational. Basic income programs have only seriously been proposed at the national or local levels. So, as with other welfare programs, debates over basic income will undoubtedly be bound up with questions about nationality and migration. In the European context, we should be wary of the deployment of basic income to solidify Fortress Europe as the refugee crisis intensifies. In the debates over the Swiss program, for example, Lucy Stam, a member of parliament for the right-wing Swiss People's Party, said he could imagine supporting UBI but only for the Swiss. Theoretically, if Switzerland were an island, the answer is yes, he said at the time. But with open borders, it's a total impossibility, especially for Switzerland, with a high living standard.
Yeah, so that is, I think, points to the real, I think, problem with UBI, which is that I don't think it causes domestic problems, for instance, like deficit spending. I don't give a shit about that. But where it does create problems is, I think, where you interface with the outside world. Like all of a sudden, Korea is making way more plasma TVs because Americans can afford them now, for instance, right? Like you're putting all this consumer power democratically into people's hands. That's going to create, like, I mean, you might know this better than I do, but that seems like that's, if Nixon, for instance, at almost, or maybe the end of the height of American power, but when we were relatively more powerful than we are now, let's say he does even a really good UBI back in the 70s. That's on the backs of, you know, the rest of the world, right?
Look, no, I think it's actually sort of circular logic. What actually necessitates, which, you know, in my view, makes some sort of UBI type program inevitable in a consumption-based, you know, economy, is that, as we've been talking about, productivity and demand for labor. And so even with, you know, quote unquote, you know, globalization and outsourcing, all these things, even there, it's not like we buy from China is the stereotype, but no, it was, first it was Chinese, you know, labor, and then it moved on to other Asian countries, and it was like Bangladesh labor. And what they find is they move to a country and they get the cheap labor, and then the next generation has higher standards, living expenses and living expectations rise over time. And so they have to keep chasing around this cheaper labor. What happens is eventually they run out of the cheapest labor and they just automate the thing. And there's robots making the TVs, to continue your example. And so, I think that trend in itself is just playing out on a global scale, and it necessitates these, UBI programs themselves.
Yeah, but wouldn't it, if one country does a UBI, isn't that going to create strain on supply chains?
No, I don't think so. I don't think. I think there are natural limits to how many TVs people need, and the costs come down over time. And I don't. They're pretty cheap now. But to this quote, I do like. They mentioned the citizens' dividend again, whether you call it freedom or citizens. Mm-hmm. I think, reframing.
I'll take people's dividend
is important. Yeah, and people's. I understand the criticism or the concern of being too nationalist, but also I think there's something to be said. Again, we were talking about national service. I think there's something to be said about the dignity of citizenship, which also gets to the some of these anxieties. I think on the right, when people are concerned about immigration, obviously the immigrants are used as a scapegoat, right, to justify the continuing economic policies that justify the rich, rather than deal with the actual underlying source of these trends. But I think they've. Basically, the right has been beating down in these libertarian views, extreme libertarian views have been beating down what it means to be the state, which is the representation of the people. We've been outsourcing these jobs. People have seen their wages stagnate over decades. They want to know that there is some sort of dignity in their citizenship. And this is also one way you can address that. Like, look, this is what you get. We are a wealthy nation. This is how, the fruits of our labor are distributed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just a bit uneasy if that, like, we are a wealthy nation turns into, like, I don't know. To me, it's like the second you do basic income in America, you have to start working on how you're going to spread this throughout the world more broadly.
Said a more concise way, and taking it back to, he had a quote in the book, and he said, I might be paraphrasing, but what essentially was he was saying was he was talking about the, there's obviously an individualist streak, in this country, an individual mindset, particularly in the boomer generation over the last few decades. But anyway, there's that individualist mindset versus problems that are collective in nature. Mm-hmm. Meaning, things like this, meaning things like global warming, inequality. These are systemic problems. And we've gone through a generation, this conservative generation, arguably tied to, boomer demographics. I'm reading this book currently about it. We should do an episode on it maybe. But these are these individualist mindsets. And I feel like the things like citizens' dividend, national service is sort of a nudge. Hey, look, there is a country. There is something to be, meant in being a citizen of this country and serving your part in voting and participating in the process, and not just being a passive consumer, that just wants to live, alone.
I will say, with regards to that national service, got to be compensated. I don't like the Buttigieg talk about volunteerism.
Well, look, okay, so about the UBI, yeah. So I do think there would be some national service component that would be useful to package this with. I think some sort of national service could actually help programs like UBI, Medicare for All, and free college tuition help possibly come sooner and more robustly than they might otherwise. But I think you need to design the national service system in a way so that it's not means testing for an expense. There needs to be, I think people should be compelled to serve in some way, but there should be plenty of exemption if you're of, certain disadvantages, physical disability or whatever it may be. But also a number of unique and individual ways people can contribute to their society. That doesn't mean necessarily work in a traditional sense, but maybe, there are various ways people can contribute to their society.
Right. And so the thing that I think, and where Rutger might side with you on the in favor of rhetoric in terms of the nationalistic appeals, which I think is not that big of a huge area of disagreement. He does make maybe the most forthright case for open borders of, especially people who in the United States would consider themselves nominally to his left. like Bregman just goes all out in support of open borders. He calls the border wage gap the most significant wage gap there is. And
he says open borders, I forget the figure, but he says it would contribute an extra, like many trillions of dollars extra to the economy.
Yeah, and the regular critique from the left on those sorts of arguments is that it shouldn't be up to whether it makes money or not. But at the same time, it certainly helps, pad out an argument. Here's a little bit of Bregman on immigration from this How to Build a Better World.
Open borders. Mm-hmm. But this is so spectacularly counterintuitive at the moment. I think I'm right that the book first came out in Dutch in 2014, is that correct? Yeah. Since then, there's
2 years before the English.
A huge surge in right-wing populism, Trump's election, Brexit, building the notion of walls, identitarianism throughout Europe, and nativism. So it's fair to say, I think, that the argument in favour of open borders is not actually winning the day, which is not to say it's wrong.
Yeah.
And it's what I really wanted to ask you is, starting from where we are, rather than from in a kind of intellectual laboratory, how do you get to the point where, you deal with a lot of the myths about immigration, but they are very entrenched. How do you build an intellectual and narrative rooted in empiricism, but also in ideas and emotions, that will bring people to realize that, as you say, that actually open borders are a massive generator of wealth?
Well, I really think we need the historical perspective here. So my view as a historian is that history is the most subversive of all the sciences. The main message of history is,
I like that message,
things can be different. Yeah. Right? There's nothing inevitable about the way we've structured our society and economy right now. So if you think about borders, for example, or the nation state, it's a fairly recent invention, It's really a product of the 19th century. And for example, passports, they hardly existed at the beginning of the 20th century. And the countries that issued them, like Russia and the Ottoman Empire, were considered, backwards countries. So an interesting question always to ask as a historian is, how will people of the future look back on us? Because we can look back on people in the Middle Ages, right?
Yeah.
And we look at, those witch hunts and all those barbarian things that were going on, and we're like, oh, these people were terrible. We're so civilized right now. But then the question is, of course, what are the barbarian things we are doing right now? Let's say in the year 2200. What will they say about us? What's the most horrible thing we're doing right now? We just consider it common sense. And borders might be one of those things, because borders are responsible for the biggest, discrimination that's going on. Like 60% of your income is dependent on the fact where you were born. It's apartheid on a global scale, basically. And most of the objections we have against immigration, they're all terrorists, they're all criminals, they don't work, they take our jobs, etc. I go over all of them in their book. They destroy social cohesion. Many of them have actually also been adopted these days by the left. But if you look at the actual evidence, there's not much there. There's really not much there.
So, to put it in its purest and ghastliest topicality, how would you, if you were confronted with a dismayed Brexit voter, explain to them that open borders are a good thing?
That's a great question. So I would use the language of patriotism. That's the first thing. This is often a problem with many people on the left and progressive, is that they only use the language of care and of injustice, right? And there's a certain part of the population that is receptive to that kind of question. You say, oh, it's so horrible what's happening to these refugees, or it's so horrible what's happening to these poor people, we should help them. But you don't win elections with that, right? So you need other things. One thing you could do is to say, we're the best country on earth, right? And we can handle this. Like what Angela Merkel did in Germany. Like, we're schaffen das because we're Germans, right? So the French couldn't schaffen this. They couldn't do it. The British certainly couldn't do it. But we're Germans. We can handle this. We're good at organizing stuff. That was a very patriotic statement. And many people said that it would become our downfall. Well, last time I checked, she's still there.
Yeah.
So...
and how well that ages, I think, remains to be seen.
Yeah. But he is great with the framing, basically, and the epilogue of the book. He has sort of a call to arms, and he talks about the Overton window, aka framing, and that's really what is at the heart of a lot of his analogies and comments.
Yeah, and the only other thing that makes me a little bit cautious about his argument is the openness to conditions upon citizenship, and I understand that this might be inevitable in certain respects, but work requirements, it basically creates a certain class of worker, and we get to exploit you a little bit more because you're here not quite as a citizen yet, probably wouldn't be getting the UBI, for instance, right? You're that more precarious. You'll need to do jobs that regular citizens that are established here with our great Medicare for all and UBI and decommodified housing, they get all that. I'm a little bit cautious of that, but other than that, I think he's very good at making the case for open borders, and and at a time where I think it's very difficult to make a case in a practical conversation for anything other than demilitarizing and humanizing the border.
Look, I mean, I think we were just talking about framing, and I think in terms of framing the realm of what's possible, that good, he's making a good argument. I think in reality, Utopia. Right, Utopia, right, and he's staking a flag on one end, and that's good. I mean, obviously I think you need healthy and robust legal immigration programs, and those programs, what people don't understand is people have a zero-sum mindset when it comes to immigration. Like, oh, we're letting 1 million people come here per year out of a country of 350 million or whatever, and they're like, that's taking prosperity away from us. What they don't understand is they're not taking a piece of your pie. It's not being redistributed in smaller pieces. That pie is growing, right. And so on a net basis, you are better off now. In order to sustain those programs, you do need certain social infrastructure, and citizenship should have some dignity, meaning it comes with certain benefits like healthcare and education and things like that. But if you think about it on on a long-term basis, you do need labor to be able to move around. But on a short-term basis, like in a year, for example, if you think of the smallest country you could think of, I don't know if, I don't know, name a small country. It doesn't matter. Maybe there's 1 million people there. If they all came here in 1 year, guess what? The tax receipts of that country would go bankrupt.
Right.
They would have no money. And also, where would they move? Say they all moved to New York City. Like, how would that work on housing prices? Housing has to be built, in the short term, there are some practical realities that have to be worked out in situations like this. But the truth is that on a net basis, immigration makes everyone better off.
Right. And there shouldn't be borders. Just to go over quickly the chapters here. There's 10 chapters. The open borders one comes a bit later, but there's the chapter 3. We've already talked about the first couple. The end of poverty. Goes into casino money, the different sort of case studies that lead to, turns out having more money good for things. Like he cites a 13 to 14 IQ points difference. Now IQ's
I have some billionaires that would like to disagree with that.
Dubious, exactly, dubious utility.
You should meet the Koch brothers.
He also mentions, which I appreciate in sort of contrast to Pinker, he talks about the importance of childhood poverty. It's fucking the idea that there is lunch debt in America, the richest country on earth, is appalling. But absolute poverty he takes issue with, but he also takes issue with fractal inequality, and just inequality in general, which means a society is happier the less wealth stratified it is,
and the data plays that out.
Yeah, exactly. And they literally
meaning that even for the rich, regardless of how you want to avoid framing the situation, meaning you don't have to use the guillotine necessarily to say that even rates of he uses there's statistics for psychological disorders and things like that.
Even the guillotine days in the French Revolution, all the guys operating the guillotine, they weren't poor people. they were either, like low shopkeepers or lawyers. Right?
People with estates to redistribute. They were like, hey, that looks good.
Yeah. Fractal inequality is an important thing. Chapter 4 is the bizarre tale of President Nixon and his basic income, which talks about Nixon's basic income, $1,600 a year to family of 4. Nixon had the quote, Tory men and liberal policies changed the world, blah, blah, blah. But, what, do you have any take on those?
Well, so the chapter, it tells a story where Nixon is like, he takes over from the Great Society, from LBJ, and there's all this social change. And the UBI was a popular program. Hayek, and these conservative thinkers, Nobel Prize winning economists, had touted this idea. So he's like, yeah, we're going to do this. And the chapter, talks about him being on board, and there's this bill, and then one of his advisors brings up some random story, from like the 1800s about how some Victorian age program went wrong, and he's like, no, you know what, scrap it, and like total change of heart. It was interesting. It is sort of dissatisfying. I feel like there must have been something else there swaying his, maybe that's exactly how it was, and he was that impressionable, but it is sort of dissatisfying. Unfortunately,
the Nixon tapes weren't in operation yet, so we don't have tapes from that era. I was going to look into that, and I'm like, damn, 1970, that's not it. What year was it? I'm not sure. Yeah, but it was pre the tapes. There's also the other case. One of the other case studies apparently showed an increase in the divorce levels. So fuck that. Women are divorcing their husbands. There's no way we can give them the freedom to do that. Turns out that was a rounding error or something like that, or a Excel error, which is kind of like Rogart and Rivlin or whatever.
Oh yeah, and that PhD candidate found it.
Yeah.
And I will say as a criticism, look, forgive me if I'm mistaken, but I was pretty sure that when I went through all of the case studies he cited were resoundingly robust and properly executed. I have no doubt that they should be. But there was also been a lot of case studies that were incorrectly carried out or insufficient, whether they were funded too low or weren't carried out long enough or given to a broad enough stretch of the population, or weren't given out to the right people under the right circumstances, and I feel like he sort of glossed over that in such a way that it might hurt his argument. But I feel like he would have done better to address those up front and say, look, you can't run shitty experiments basically and expect to get good answers out of this. It has to be done in the right way. It has to be done broadly, and it has to be a sufficient amount of income and for a sufficient amount of time for the effects to be realized.
And I think there have been criticisms of his case study selection a little bit, so it'd be interesting to see that developed a little bit more. Chapter 5, A New Figures for a New Era, basically a critique of GDP, which I thought was interesting. Puts it in a Cold War, sort of wartime context, as if that's what it's the best for showing. I thought it was interesting that when it was originally being discussed in the 50s, they compared it to a satellite that can oversee all of the country's production. Do you have any comments on the GDP section?
About the formulation of it as a statistic?
About GDP as just a metric we should not deify so much.
Look, GDP is a useful metric. I think its evolution will be in that it's not an entire metric. I think it's a great metric for valuing the amount of mass shit that is produced in this country and sold. But if people spending more on healthcare because their pharmaceutical companies are increasing the prices by 1,000%, increases economic output. I don't think that's very productive in a human way that we would consider it in a long run. And so I think, people talk about changing a GDP calculation. I think it's more likely you would have GDP because it is useful for an economic sense for measuring things, but it would just be then a part of a bigger weighting, that includes other, Gini coefficients or some sort of inequality or equality of life metrics, that balance that out, I think.
Yeah. So chapter 6, a 15-hour work week, basically gets into John Maynard Keynes' prediction leisure, and then also the fear of leisure as by elites, and into the Jetsons. The amount of issues, I'm especially interested in this, and I do think the left should start talking more about work week reductions. But the different problems he says it could solve: stress, which I think is fairly straightforward. People have to work less; they'll be less stressed. Climate, which I think is another thing. Less activity is generally good for climate. Accidents, straightforward. Unemployment, having to work less. Not that unemployment's a huge problem here, although it depends which measure of unemployment you look at. Gender inequality. So yeah, I don't think we have any issues with a work week reduction.
Yeah. I think it's nice to see Keynes so prominently figured as the critique just mentioned. Sort of a background hero character. I would also argue that Martin Luther King, was very great in this space too, and arguing for it. But yeah, look, it's people are used to this 40-hour work week, and it's so sacrosanct. And people are like, oh, then this is what they wrap their identity around now. But people don't realize that it used to be more than that. People fought for 40, and that was low.
Right.
That was low. And guess what? Like banning child labor, increasing the amount of time that young people are in school from 16 to 18, and then putting them in college. All that is managing the demand and the labor, the supply of the labor force, with the demand, and removing people from that pool, and basically, going from 40 to something lower over time, makes a lot of sense, obviously, but it's not as dramatic as people think. If we went from 40 to 25 or 20, in a generation, people would be sticking to that. Like that is the benchmark of dignity in their work or whatever it may be.
Right.
And there was also, he was talking about, Bregman, so to counter that, Keynes was like, people should be working less over time. And he says that one reason that has not been the case, because at the heart of that statement is Keynes looking at productivity and saying, mapping that out into the future and saying, we would be able to produce this current income with much less inputs, i.e. labor, people, over time. Therefore, we could support the current output with much less of the current people working to do so. Implicit in that is assuming that in that trade-off that the more productive you get that leisure time, you get that time off. And so what Bregman is saying, we've essentially traded that. You don't get that time back, you get additional consumption power. And to go hand in hand with that, to entice and encourage that, wanting that additional power, instead of, i.e. having more free time each week, going to your employer and spending that time working so you have extra cash to go buy stuff means you have to encourage this consumption economy and people wanting to go out and buy, more and more shit.
Right. And important to note in any discussion of production and wages is that they decouple basically around the time that the Mount Pelican Society. Yeah. Surprisingly, those guys at Bregman cites the Friedmanite neoliberals.
Meaning the more productive the economy got, those benefits were going more and more to the actual labor force that were producing those productivity increases. And eventually all of those additional benefits from productivity were going to the capital holders and to the managerial class.
Do you remember that note by an analyst that's like, God damn it, the owners of capital get shafted again? Do you recall?
Oh, I sent you a research note from a major bulge bracket bank. I forget what I think it's like.
Damn it, more of it going to labor, as if that's a problem in America.
Exactly. Yeah. It was like people paying their employees more, and they're like, "What? Why do we have to give more to labor? Why can't we go more to shareholder buybacks or whatever?"
Yeah, exactly. The real productive stuff. So yeah, chapter 6 for now Workweek. Chapter 7 is basically his restating of the David Graeber bullshit jobs thing. Talks about certain jobs like sanitation has an impact when you strike, and if you're, for instance, a banker in Ireland. People will just do IOUs at the pub.
That was a crazy story that he shared.
Yeah. Do you want to hear a little bit more about that?
That was pretty interesting. Yeah, he talked about, like, there's this case study, I think it was in the 70s in Ireland or something, and and basically all the bankers went on strike, as a, maybe a public sector, employer, like a teacher might today. In Ireland in the 70s, a bunch of bankers did, and they're like, you know what, we're not going to have banking services. And the public's like, all right, guess what, we don't need you. And they actually had this sort of, barter type economy develop, and the pubs were playing like a surprisingly central role in helping people, exchange value and keep the economy afloat.
Yeah, here he talks about that a little bit in this how to.
Damn.
I will say I think it's limited example, or maybe temporal as well. Maybe that doesn't last forever, but I think it is powerful in that it shows you the city. If sanitation, another example that he brings up, if something like sanitation workers go on strike or teachers, society is going to immediately feel that has massive impact. But obviously, they see if segments of the financial sector go on strike, life goes on, surprisingly, sometimes.
Yeah, or flight attendants or the flight staff, as we found out in the shutdown crisis.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's the thing. People can believe in meritocracy if it's a fair meritocracy. Yes. So that's what I'm really trying to do in this book, is that we often say that the stronger shoulders should carry the heaviest weights, and actually the really stronger shoulders that carries us all are the teachers, are the garbage collectors, are the nurses, because if they would go on strike, that'd be a disaster. Maybe to one final story that I have in the book about this is there were two strikes of different professions in the 60s. One was of garbage collectors. Strike lasted for 6 days. Total emergency had to be declared in New York. Yeah. Total emergency. Turns out we can't do without garbage collectors. The other strike was of bankers 2 years later in Ireland. And the bankers, they were angry that their wages were not keeping up with inflation. And they said, you know what, you'll have it, we'll go on strike. And all the experts predicted disaster. This was supposed to be like a heart attack for the economy. Strike started, nothing much happened.
And
lasted for 6 months.
And pubs turned out to be very important.
Yeah, this is the hilarious part, is that actually, so the strike lasted for 6 months, the economy just kept growing. After 6 months, the bankers came back and said, all right, we'll get back to work. And what the Irish did is really interesting. What they did is they sort of built their own money system. So they started writing checks to each other, IOUs, on the backs of cigar boxes and on toilet paper. And there were 15,000 pubs back then in Ireland, and sort of the pub owners became the new bankers. There's one historian who later wrote that if you sell liquids to other people, you probably also know something about the liquidity of your clients. So these pub owners were the perfect new bankers, and the system worked quite well, actually. Okay. And businesses just kept operating. Nowadays, if you ask people who lived through that period, you'll find out that many people just won't remember because it didn't make much of an impact.
I mean, now that Ireland's basically owned by banks, maybe that's a dark irony on it now, but it's basically a tax haven.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah. They have a very favorable corporate taxes. I think it was actually, maybe it was Iceland I was thinking of it. It was one of those countries out there. I think it might have been Iceland, where like in the 2008 financial crisis, it was great. They, instead of bailing their people out, they were just like, well, we're just going to wipe out all this debt, basically.
Jubilee, baby.
Let it go.
I mean, it's a biblical concept, folks. You want to talk about, speaking to people in languages they understand. Let's bring Jubilees back. Jesus was a fan. Student jet Jubilee, medical. A fun fact about the Bernie Student College thing is when that was announced, Michael Brooks, host of the Michael Brooks Show, which I also produce, it tweeted out that, it'd be nice to see this happen for medical debt as well. And one of Bernie's policy people added him with a winky face. So little sneak peek at what might be coming down the pike from the Bernie Sanders crew there. It
was, another thing about Bregman that, going back to, and I wish, so I listened to the audiobook, so I didn't read the book. I can't follow the source.
Right.
But he had a quote when we were talking about reducing spreading the labor around, reducing labor hours. He was talking about how Henry Ford and Kellogg actually experimented with 8 and 6 hour days, and they were very successful with it. But then he had this anecdote about Apple employees working 90 hours a week and, quote, loving it in the 1980s. And then he said researchers found that if they only worked 40 hours a week instead of 90, we might have gotten the first Mac 1 year earlier. Now, I thought that was really interesting. I wrote it down in my notes, but I have no idea what that, how you would even...
That seems like a pretty
spurious
cavalier extrapolation. Yeah. I mean, that's a big problem in software in general is the crunch, which is, especially in video games, right before release date, everybody's working like insane hours to the point of like putting your health in jeopardy. And I mean, likewise, I mean, you see that in finance too. And it's not healthy, and it's hard to know how to manage it, but it's basically the dictates of capitalism in each industry.
Well, especially in computer science, where there's a shortage of labor, which necessitates that. That's why wages are high, is because it's this emerging science, and the economy wasn't, it didn't train enough people for that. So people are getting, these massive paydays in that field.
And that's why there's all this free propaganda about please code so we can.
Well, exactly. And then once they do that, then you bring the price of it down, and the wages come down over time. So it's, again, you're always chasing these returns around the corner, and eventually you're going to run out of those, cigarette butts, and you're going to need some sort of, just straight up, some sort of distribution program to support your consumption economy.
Right. And so chapter 80 moves on, Race Against the Machine, where he gets into the automation issues, and has one of the parts that I actually really disagree with Bregman on. So he goes into this spiel about futurologist Ray Kurzweil, who I think is kind of a quack, although to be fair, I haven't really looked into his stuff. But he's a big singularity guy. And I don't mind reading stuff like that, or the Michio Kaku. We're gonna have space elevators that can fly us to Mars, and
Kurzweil, they both have some interesting, they're I wouldn't discredit them. What I would say is that their predictive abilities are based solely on the technology, and what they fail to consider are social and political and economic considerations that would impact that evolution.
Right. So Bregman says, they're talking about Moore's law and computing power, and Bregman says, it's worth pointing out that computing power is not the same thing as intelligence, but still, we dismiss his predictions at our peril. After all, it wouldn't be the first time that we underestimated the power of exponential growth. And this is page 191, he says, of the paperback. This time is different. The $1 million question is, what should we do? What new jobs will the future bring? And more importantly, will we want to do those new jobs? And to me, I think that's not precise. The real question is, who owns the shit, right? And whose benefit do the dividends, if we want to go back to that term, accrue to? It's not about I think he skips over that. And I think generally this book doesn't focus enough on that aspect of it. Is it Jeff Bezos who owns everything? Is it Mark Zuckerberg with his new Facebook bucks? Is he in control of all this? And I think that's what Bregman doesn't. That's my $1 million question. And Bregman wants to kind of, and I kind of appreciate it. And as he said, this book is a little bit out of date because you have AOCs that have come around to imagine a little bit more. But then the rubber hits the road about those things.
Yeah, I will. When we first started talking about UBI, one of the first things, and when I talk about the subject, I always go to the composition of our GDP, 70% consumption based. And I don't think that's a term that he brought up at all.
Consumption?
Or just that statistic. I feel like when you're talking about UBI, pointing out, FYI, 0.7 of every dollar spent, in calculating this GDP figure is consumption based. in the velocity of money argument, right? That the original Wolf of Wall Street or whatever guy it was. It's no, not Jordan Belfort.
The original Wall Street.
Gordon Gekko.
Gordon Gekko.
That is the economics 101. I feel like Bregman did not make that point. I mean, he made a great case and he's talking about it. And as you said, it seems to be like a collective, a sort of mosaic approach, the best of each subject and making the case, which is, look, I applaud the guy. Great. More of him. I hope he gets a bigger and bigger platform to do this. He's clearly talented. But I feel like he didn't, and maybe that's because the economic thing, maybe that doesn't appeal. Maybe that's not as, sexy or something. I'm not sure. But, to me as a student, someone who enjoys, studying economics, it's like, this is inevitable because of that logic. I don't know how you could possibly square that circle without this.
Right. Yeah, okay. So I think we've just about come to the end. I mean, chapter 9 is Beyond the Gates of the Land of Plenty, where he makes his really, really strong case for open borders. And it's not just the economic case. He makes the moral case by way of economics. It's economic apartheid, literally, right? Like we talk about, is NAFTA good for the United States or Mexico? It's like, well, the problem is, and actually this is frankly the problem with Elizabeth Warren, which is when you make it nationalistic, you obscure the fact that capitalists' interests go cross borders and so do labor's, right? In reality, it's experienced less zero-sum by nation and more zero-sum by are you an owner of capital or are you a laborer? And the way we look at these trade deals in general is kind of a problem. And that's the same way I think I prefer, Bernie's approach than Elizabeth Warren, who kind of talks for when she talks about the Green New Deal, for instance, it's all about how we need America to be the leader and shit like that. And it's like, I'd much rather us talk about how about we just cooperate to, for instance, I don't give a shit about China taking intellectual property, especially if it's in climate change related and energy related stuff. I think we need all hands on deck on this sort of stuff. So thinking more cooperatively, I just think is a better approach than being competitive about it. But maybe Elizabeth Warren's right and she'll win the presidency on that.
Look, I think there's something, you're right, and you would hope that you wouldn't have to appeal to people's interests and or certain instincts, and you should hope that you can make a moral case, and then that would be enough. And that's ideal, of course. But I think there's something to be said if you're trying to push bold legislation, if you have to appeal to national pride, there's something to be said. There's something to be said, and like as I said, dignity and citizenship, if you want to call it that or whatever. But if you want to say, hey, look, there's something. It means something to be a citizen of this great country. It means that we don't have people going bankrupt, because they need health care. People can, not worry about getting sick. They contribute to the economy. They're not sleeping in the streets. They're not living in, desolate poverty. It means something. There's value to that. And it's because we're so great or whatever, you can have pride in your society when you have, if it's warranted, if you're doing things well. I mean, there's something to be said there. And I think politically that's sort of a reality you'll be unable to avoid.
Yeah, unfortunately. Orwell in The Beginning of The Lion and the Unicorn begins it writing, and that Lion and the Unicorn is actually a case for, frankly, if you wanted to term it dangerously, a term of nationalistic socialism. He would probably term it patriotic. The distinction between patriotic and nationalism he makes being that nationalistic is offensive and patriotism is defensive. I don't know how
one is more bellicose than the other.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, if you want to make that distinction, fine. I mean, Orwell does. So, I mean, there's your argument from authority.
Or just dignity. Look, patriotism, dignity. Social. I could see one is more offensive rather than defensive.
Yeah, but we're talking about should we try to stand up to nationalism? This essay is kind of interesting because Orwell begins it. As I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead trying to kill me. This is written during World War II, during the Blitz. And Orwell was in London. They do not feel any enmity against me as an individual, nor I against them. They are only, quote, doing their duty, as the saying goes. Most of them, I have no doubt, are kind-hearted, law-abiding men who would never dream of committing murder in private life. On the other hand, if one of them succeeds in blowing me to pieces with a well-placed bomb, he will never sleep any the worse for it. He is serving his country, which has the power to absolve him from evil. And I think that recognition of nationalism's power is as eloquent as any that I've read. By the way, if you want to hear our Orweller series, patreon.com/literary hangover. But so yeah, so anyway, I do appreciate that Bregman goes into the open border arguments, because frankly, I think Bernie could have done more in 2016 and could be doing more now to specifically
challenge the framing on the issue.
Yes, challenge Trump's framing on the economic zero-sumness of this. And that might mean he has to go to sort of like, quantitative, arguments that actually they contribute to tax rolls and whatever, blah, 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 right? But you got to do it.
You're right. I mean, and he could totally tie it into his core message, which is that this is a scapegoat. People,
right,
in order to wages haven't fucking moved for, the median income for the last 40 years. Why? No, the system is just fine. It's the immigrants. It's the immigrants,
right,
doing the jobs that most people don't want to do otherwise.
It's not like wages were just about to start pairing with productivity, right, but more immigrants started coming, right?
It's why that message resonates so much, because they already feel that something isn't working. And they don't know what it is, because people keep telling them everything's working fine. All the, the key GDP indicators or whatever, unemployment is down. So they're like, well, what's the issue? It's got to be something else. And it's not the system. The system's great. Oh, it's the immigrants, right? And it's not, though.
Yeah, exactly. So chapter 10, how ideas change the world. He goes into how when prophecy fails, when end of the world prophecies fail, how do people rationalize it? Makes the point that I think is important, that educated people are better at lying to themselves. You're better at finding rationalizations for believing the wrong thing because you're just more cultured in those sorts of arguments. It's dangerous. He goes into the sort of Friedman again and Hayek and how they won. I think, again, we've already talked about that, but I don't think they just won because they had the best ideas. And I don't even think Bregman would say that, but that's kind of the implication of his argument until you start talking about power imbalance, balances, right?
I think it's interesting, too, to look at it generationally. So you sort of see if you zoom out, you see these swings between progressive eras and conservative eras, right? There's the progressive era that lasted, from the 40s roughly to 1980s or early 79ish or something, mm-hmm, and then the last 30 or 40 years have been this conservative era. I think demographics explain a lot of that in the baby boomer glut in that, and so it's you look at the academics and they provided the justification for this movement or this change in thought, but they might have just been fig leaves or whatever,
but they are important, and I probably have maybe downplayed the importance of them a little bit too much in this. I do think ideas are important, and I think it's important that, and I think AOC, I sort of hinted at earlier, I have some criticisms of AOC, but it's important that she's bringing these ideas to Congress, frankly, a very conservative institution.
Yeah. Well, and to further the point when I was talking about generation and the boomers, so you basically is, you see that you have the generation preceding them going through the world wars and the depression. They know the value of what your country can do and what it means to be a citizen and serving your role in this national, service. The boomers were born after all of that. They were born at sort of the height, of this post-World War, 2 world wars down, benefiting from Europe being destroyed and rebuilding, and basically all this gold and monetary inflow into the United States. They benefited from this and this, great society that was unfolding before them. They didn't really know that hardship. And so, they sort of, it became antisocial, and they were like, well, this is, what has government done for me lately, basically? And, now you have this generation that's raised on the global financial crisis. Two, if you want to call it the dot-com bust, and then the housing bust and the crash in 2008. And of course, the tragedy that is the current situation, with our reality television president.
Right.
And people are understanding that there is a role, there is something, here that, that we need.
And just the flaunting of the fact that we have endless cash for war. Right. Let's get the tanks.
Right. How, we'll spend 4, 5, 6 trillion in the Middle East. We'll just do a tax cut on a whim that costs, $2 trillion or whatever. At least I saw as much as 5 trillion. And then, student debt, eliminate that 1.6 trillion. Whoa. How are we going to pay for this? What's going on here? It's like, what about the bailouts that were, multiple trillions of dollars in the wars? I mean,
yeah. I just want to circle back quickly. I just remembered a certain thing. When we were talking about, I'm a bit wary of Bregman's openness to certain conditional citizenship or transitional citizenship programs. He says, well, it's better than nothing, which is, an argument. I think I would need to research before I felt confident to argue against that. But there reminded me of this article on Politico from this was about a year ago. Politico changes "What if you could get your own immigrant?" headline, and the idea was then it was you could sponsor an immigrant, right? And it's like you'd be a sponsor family for an immigrant, but it creates a real Downton Abbey, I think, scenario again. Like it's just that stuff just makes me really iffy, and I don't know what the solution is, right? Because I do think in no feasible way outside of a political revolution overthrowing certain parts of, the United States government, branches of it, you're not going to have open borders. But I don't know. What are you going to say there?
Well, I would just say that I think the idea has merit, but I don't think it is useful as an alternative to a state solution. Obviously there should be a robust program done at a national level for immigration or asylum or whatever it may be. But if you want to have additional policies where people can, volunteer, and if you, rather than force it on people, if people can say, this is, I want to, do something and contribute. And I also think there's something to be said about integration, right? Rather than if an immigrant comes here and they just are isolated in community versus living with a host family for some period of time.
Right.
If people want to volunteer additionally, incrementally, I think that's great. I don't think that you can say we're doing that instead of, in lieu of having a national program.
And you know what I want? And Bregman makes a critique of the left that they always say what they're against, not what they're for. And I think that
framing
that harmed them in Brexit, for instance. How about say I'm for, we've both been to Europe. European Union, crossing the border, right? Fairly easy thing. Yeah. We've been in the Channel bus, take a bus.
You don't even have to take your shoes off when you fly. It's crazy over there.
Yeah. That's what we should. I want that with Mexico. I want that with Uruguay. I want that with all those motherfuckers. I mean, not Brazil right now because they're on timeout with the fascism business. And probably a few others out there doing the fascism. But Mexico's okay. AMLO, a bit worried about AMLO. AMLO,
you got your eye on him?
I got my eye on AMLO because he comes in, he says a lot of the right things, but a few of my followers have messaged me with things I have not followed up on about AMLO that maybe suggest he's taken a bit of a neoliberal turn, but don't take that as just you do your own research on that because I haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I mean, obviously people are seeing that. That's the writing on the wall. You're seeing that in the current debates here is, Bernie Sanders has already won. The Democratic debates are who can out Bernie, who
right.
can, and Medicare for all. People are just like, oh, just say Medicare for all. Even if the devil's in the details, obviously, and what actually that means, or Medicare for all if you want it, if as Buttigieg says, or,
right.
People are, so you're already seeing that being co-opted, people see that is where the direction is going.
Exactly. And then we just have the epilogue, and we've actually just kind of touched on that, is not Buttigieg, Rutger Bregman. he's
so many B's.
He takes an attack. He attacks what he calls underdog socialism, which is this always like you're playing from behind sort of thing. And I do think the left needs to know that we have the people on our side and speak with that confidence. That's why I'm going to disappoint some people here. Is I don't think Andy No should have been punched in Portland recently or wherever the fuck he was. Did you hear about this?
No, I have not heard.
He's a sort of crypto reactionary propagandist that works for Quillette, but he was doing a Proud Boy or Patriot Prayer rally, covering a Patriot Prayer rally, and he's a big anti-Antifa guy.
Okay.
And some Antifa people milkshaked and then silly stringed him, but then this other guy ran up and just decked him. And my defense of I love milkshaking. I think milkshaking is a great thing. Milkshake fascists. If I could milkshake somebody, even if I had to spend a few nights in jail, I would do it. Like milkshake Trump, for instance. Or I don't think you should do it to people who are marginal. I think you should do it to people who are genuinely like bad, right? Like for instance, like almost overt white supremacy, neo-Nazis, I think. But the milkshake thing, and you definitely have to film it too. That's part of the whole thing. But a milkshake it's not meant to harm, it's meant to shame.
Well, that's the difference is humiliation over violence.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's why, like, okay, if you want to say milkshaking someone is battery.
Or egging, like that kid in
exactly.
Australia.
That kid's a hero. These people are heroes. I genuinely believe that. Those are positive role models, right?
Well, they don't want to be humiliated. Their shit is all about being strong man and, like...
Exactly. So, like, my thing is, like, it's about not harming, but... Okay, so I'm a left-wing producer, some would say propagandist, right? Let's say someone wants to egg/milkshake me. Please do that if you're a fascist, right? If you think I'm too, like, supportive of like open borders, for instance, or like even I say concentration camps.
That's like, here's where I dwell, here's where I hang out.
The thing is I will be. Please film it because that will be good for my media career. Because guess what? I'm not ashamed of those things. The thing about milkshaking is it only affects people when they know that they have something to be ashamed of, right? Or you get egged, right? Like otherwise, okay, a fascist wants to egg me. I'm going to get sympathy. That's what happens, right? Like, and even certain people have sympathy for the fascist that says, like, he's been doing like that Australian politician that got egged. He's an anti-Muslim bigot. It's as simple as that. I mean, look it up for yourself if you don't believe me, and use as a mark of my credibility. I'm fairly confident you'll come to the same conclusion. And that kid put the egg on his head, right? And like certain people might have sympathy for that, but then you're like, oh wait, actually that motherfucker like incited violence against Muslims. Yeah. Fuck that guy.
You're gonna laugh before you feel, the same that you would if he was assaulted, physically, which you were saying, like, you feel no shame, so it's not effective. And so if the response is overdone, then that person is not going to feel shame for that. They're going to be sort of like a mini martyr. They're going to be like, I was assaulted for this, that I shouldn't have been assaulted. And they're right. They shouldn't have been assaulted. They should be humiliated and pointed out and contradicted and proved wrong, but they shouldn't be physically assaulted,
Ed Miliband, our good pal, the former labor leader, here's him getting egged, right? And nobody freaked out about the violence of the right.
First of all, we ran a very good campaign. We talked to 30,000 voters since January, talking about Labour's plans on jobs, apprenticeships, housing, the things that matter to people. We've also got people, I think, who thought... We've also...
Just egged him?
On his shoulder at that. Not even in the face.
Yeah. Obviously not one of my fans. No.
See, he just laughs it off, right? Because guess what? He's not ashamed about what he's speaking about. He's not saying, like, actually, let's be very suspicious of our Muslim neighbors. Let's restrict immigration. Let's, let's be British first or whatever the fuck, right?
Also notice I don't feel sorry for Ed Miliband there. I don't feel sorry. It is sort of like, humiliating or embarrassing or whatever, but I don't feel sorry for him all. But if someone came up and violently punched him in the face, even if I wasn't agreeing with this guy, I'd be like, oh man, that was kind of uncalled for. Like, what the fuck,
And so that's why I think like Andy No is a borderline. I mean, he's from like Tiny Toisi, who's been arrested for violent fascism. Andy Knows gave him good press coverage. So like crypto-fascist propagandist is not, in my opinion, an unfair label for Andy Ngo. And when you punch him in the face on camera, you give him exactly what he wants. You give him content he needs to do his job. I mean, he's made so much money off of this. If he would have just been milkshaked, that is, guess what? That's content for me. That's something I can play on Majority Report and be like, this is very funny.
I feel like humor just broadly is so underused in the political spectrum, arena, and it should be used. I mean, here in Humiliation, that's a form of comedy, but it's important.
And this is not to say that this is not to criticize Antifa broadly. I think there's certain parts of Black Bloc that I think are counterproductive, but I think Antifa itself is nothing more or less than a societal sort of antibody response to existing fascism. I think we have existing fascism in America today. I think you're going to see people react negatively to that, and I think that should be, I think if you want to see that go away, you should deal with the fascism. And I'll also say to people, though, on the other hand, it might technically be battery to milkshake, say, Donald Trump or Stephen Miller or any other member of the administration. And look, the more power they have, the better, right? If you can milkshake a Koch brother, do it. But know that might technically be battery. Like this is the law, right? And we haven't done an episode on Thoreau's civil disobedience now, but that's part of it. And it's our job, and my job specifically as a sort of member of the left-wing media, to, come to those people's defense, and like, as the extent I can share a GoFundMe or something for them, do it. But it might hurt to do this. You have to know that going. I don't want to lie to people beforehand, saying, "Oh no, it's nothing more than a woman throwing a drink on a man at a bar." The law is going to look at it a little bit differently.
You may be restrained physically, and there will be legal consequences.
Yeah, and these are fascists. They might that kid in Australia got the shit kicked out of him by those guys.
But Mandela went to jail. Rosa Parks, everyone, was persecuted at the time.
If you can put your body on the line, try to do it on camera.
That picture of Bernie getting dragged away in handcuffs.
I mean, look, let's face it, that's political capital.
It's crazy on the right. Like my grandpa first off, the right has been, radicalizing old people on Facebook. But my grandpa they shared that picture of Bernie getting dragged off, but they're like, this is Bernie. He was protesting desegregating student housing or some shit like that. Right. It's like, what? That's like the fucking...
That's earned media, baby.
Yeah. Or no, it was the building of some sort of housing, but it was so misconstrued,
I got one more little section of Bregman that I think, so I'm going to give Bregman a thumbs up. I am very skeptical of UBI at our point in history. I don't think that's all Bregman brings to the table. But I think, and I will concede that a lot of what he brings to the table comes from his, being a magazine writer and bringing other people's ideas to the table. No problem in that. I'm just saying that exploitation is inherent to our capitalist economy. But he also, I like this message he gives here, which is sort of advice. And he has an advice for moderates that I think is important. And it's one that I definitely co-sign. Oh, do you have anything to say before we...
I was going to say that I also, I also give it a thumbs up. He's a fantastic messenger. I hope, as I already said, that he is given a bigger platform in some way. Mm-hmm. This is it's going to be a very politically tricky, economic change, but also a necessary. It's just hard. If I just think from like a first principles, basis from economic, 101 and reason up from there, it's hard for me to, not come to this as some sort of solution, as a government policy.
I agree.
So, you need people out here making this case.
Yeah. And I think that's why I feel, and I hear Rutger's argument that the left needs to elaborate their version of what a UBI should look like, and I kind of do that. I spend some time of some of my propagandizing time doing that. As in like purely additive, universal for everyone, regardless of what kind of benefits, whether that's, certain tax write-offs or social or, disability insurance, right? Don't give a fuck. Give it to everybody. I think it is inevitable, so I want to work on the other things. I want to make healthcare decommodified. I mean, I always talk about this, but when I was in France and person I was with, shout out, I had a health scare, went in, went out free. The idea that your money is no good here is something that needs to be extended throughout society. And then we can start talking about giving everybody we can give everybody money first, but then we can start talking about the other things, like the attacking the welfare state. But Bregman here, do you have anything you want to plug, Twitter or the newsletter?
So we have the information in newsletter. There hasn't been much in the last 6 months. There's probably something coming soon.
It'll be a good resource for the election run-up.
We're going to do more for the election. Probably, it used to be weekly. It'll probably be, maybe monthly or with some one-off things. Also, I'm going to write something about, a longer narrative on power in America.
Chris has been reading Robert Caro, Lyndon Baines Johnson.
It helped me formulate, and I'd had these thoughts over a year ago, well before I started the books, but it was interesting just to see someone write a book about power as a topic. I hadn't, seen it through that lens, but I just feel like it's a useful narrative across all of these things we're talking about now, and why things are the way they are currently, so... that will be, maybe something related to the newsletter, maybe something longer form at some point.
Cool. All right. So, and I'll just say, if you have some extra cash lying around, and if you don't, well, look, here's the thing. And even if you're already a patron, here's a little secret. I haven't been super diligent in making sure certain tiers get certain content. Everybody gets it, even if you go under the $4 minimum. If you want to come aboard for under $4, come aboard. Patreon.com/literary hangover. Now, I want to get to Rutger's message to the moderates that I teased earlier as our way out. But thank you, Chris, for joining me once again.
Happy to do it.
And we will see you again in a few weeks.
Let's have another final round of... yes, I see a gentleman there. Just there. Yeah. No. Yeah, just... That's it.
Hi, thanks for everything tonight. I was just wondering, so you've said that you kind of represent a movement. What would your advice be to everyone here on how to kind of take your ideas forward and to actually kind of enact them in the world?
Mm-hmm. Can I answer that one immediately?
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
Okay, so the first thing is, if you're a moderate, stop that. Because you really can't afford to be one right now. If you're young in this day and age, the challenges that lie ahead of us are so immense. The transformation of the economy that we need is so radical that just tinkering around the edges just won't do it. And it doesn't matter if you see yourself as a left-wing or a right-wing person. It really doesn't matter, because the timetable for...
I thought I was done, but if you're a right-wing person, just chill. Anyway.
For climate change, it's just being set by reality. We need to act, and we need to act quickly.